So our group focused on Ceratomorpha, which includes tapirs and rhinos. And I looked at the evolutionary history of the lineage. So starting off, I'll talk about the evolutionary origin of Ceratomorpha from Perissodactyla. The origins and classifications. Perissodactyla is an order of ungulates, which includes 17 species within 3 families. This includes equidae, horses, asses, and zebras, rhinoceratidae, which are rhinoceroses, and tapiridae, which are tapirs. Perissodactyla typically have reduced the weight-bearing toes to 2 or 1 of the 5 original toes. The tapirs retain 4 toes on their front feet. The non-weight-bearing toes are either present, absent, vestigial, or positioned posteriorly. I've included the phylogenetic tree on the right, and that shows the Perissodactyla order. Okay, moving on. Looking at the historic diversity of Perissodactyla, specifically Paraceratherium. The Perissodactyla order was considerably more diverse historically, with notable extinct groups including Brontotheres, Paleotheres, Calicotheres, and the Paracetheres. Within the Paracetheres includes the largest known land mammal to have ever existed, which is the Paracetherium. And I have a picture of the Paracetherium on the left, and I have it next to an African elephant for scale. The Paracetherium lived during the Oligocene and the Miocene epochs. The Paracetherium was 18 feet tall and weighed about 20 tons, and therefore it was 3 times heavier than modern African elephants, and like I said before, among one of the largest land mammals ever recorded. There is limited fossil evidence of the Paraceratherium, but scientists believe that this huge herbivore possessed a prehensile upper lip, which was a flexible appendage that was flexible enough to grab and tear the tall leaves of trees. The structure has been compared to the proboscis of modern tapirs. Okay, so looking specifically at Ceratomorpha, the key early species and the evolutionary insights. Ceratomorpha is a distinct lineage, like I've mentioned, within Perissodactyla that involves both Rhinoceratidae and Tapiridae, which evolved soon after horse relatives, but adapted to diverse ecological niches. So early species like the Homogalax, which was around 55 million years ago and is pictured on the top right, resembled the modern tapirs with multiple toes, 4 on the forefeet and 3 on the hind feet, but were much smaller. The genus Hyraxis serves as a transitional form linking tapiroids and rhinoceratoids, and it showcases the evolutionary connections between the groups. So here's some misconceptions about Ceratomorpha. There is a common thought that there's a linkage between tapir evolution and elephant evolution. Some early scientists mistakenly grouped tapirs with elephants due to their proboscis-like noses. A proboscis is a muscular structure that is similar to an elephant's trunk. This connection was later refuted by genetic data that showed convergent evolution between the 2 species rather than common ancestry. Odd-toed ungulates, which encompasses the Perissodactyla order as a whole, were originally falsely classified with hyraxes due to similarities in ear structure and the course of the carotid artery. However, hyraxes in elephants have since been classified within Afrotheria following genetic analyses. There's also a false connection with equidae. Another misconception is that tapirs were the first members of the horse family, and that is incorrect, as tapirs and rhinos share a closer evolutionary relationship that is independent of horses. It has also been thought that rhinoceroses originated from tapiroids in the middle of the Eocene, but theories prove otherwise. There is a lack of evidence to support the evolutionary linkage between tapiroids and rhinoceroids, as scientists have spent much time looking at the individual lineages rather than the connection between the two. The evolutionary history is also contended due to a lack of genera, there's only 5, and the critical status of Ceratomorpha. Okay, looking at the specific relation between Rhinoceratidae and Tapiridae, the genus Hyraxis is considered, like I said before, a pivotal transitional genus and has features that link both tapiroids and rhinoceratoids. It appeared in the Middle Eocene and is thought to have originated from ancestors more primitive than Heptodon, which was an early tapiroid. Hyraxis fossils suggest that its traits cannot represent the common ancestor of all rhinoceratoid groups, indicating divergence within Ceratomorpha before its time. This has again caused uncertainty among scientists regarding the evolutionary origin of Ceratomorpha. Looking at the timing of divergence, early rhinoceratoids, which includes Uintaceras, emerged during the Uintan North American land mammal age, which was between 46 and 42 million years ago. Tapirids, on the other hand, were present earlier in the early Eocene. So some key morphological traits. Rhinoceratoids display a variety of adaptations, such as long limbs for browsing in Hyraconte species, or aquatic traits in Amnodontidae families. Sorry, family for Hyracontidae as well, illustrating ecological diversification. For tapirids, they are characterized by the evolution of an enlarged nasal area and a prehensile proboscis, which is a unique feature that links early and modern tapirs. There's also environmental and geographic factors that led to the speciation between Rhinoceratidae and Tapiridae. The divergence between the two families is hypothesized to have occurred due to environmental pressures and geographic separation. Early rhinoceratoids spread from Eurasia to North America during the Middle Eocene, whereas tapiroids retained their distribution in the forested areas of Central and South America, as well as Southeast Asia. Okay, so looking at the historic diversity of Ceratomorpha, within Rhinoceratidae, there is Hyracontidae, which is now extinct, but they were long-limbed, long-necked browsers. There was also Amniodontidae, which are extinct as well, and they were aquatic hippo-like species. And the only extant family is Rhinoceratidae, which are true rhinos. They emerged in the Middle Eocene, and there's 5 extant species today. Within Tapiridae, there was Heliatidae, which are now extinct, but they were small to medium sized with primitive physiques, browsing teeth, and enlarged nasal spaces that hinted at the evolution of the proboscis that we see in modern tapirs. And we also have the Tapiridae, which are modern tapirs.
I am going to be talking a little bit more about early diversity as well as ecological factors that drove the radiations in these groups. Rhinoceroses have generally been considered to have originated from tapiroids, modern tapirs and their extinct relatives, in the Middle Eocene around 40 or so million years ago. However, the transition remains controversial for scientists studying the group's evolutionary history. Rhinoceroses and tapirs are a part of Ceratomorpha, a clade within the odd-toed ungulates, aka Perissodactyla. 3 families of perissodactyls have survived into recent times, as we know, Rhinoceratidae, Tapiridae, and Equidae. We will be presenting on Ceratomorpha, or more specifically, rhinos and tapirs. Despite a long research history and numerous fossil records, the phylogeny and evolutionary history of Ceratomorpha still remain contentious. Previous phylogenetic analyses have either focused on tapiroids or rhinoceratoids without the combination of both groups. Rhinoceratoids probably originated from Hyraxis or Hyracidae, which spread from Eurasia to North America in the Middle Eocene, and has usually been considered to be a transitional form from the tapiroids to rhinoceratoids. Characteristic rhinoceratoid dental features are approached in some variants of Middle Eocene species by Hyraxis, which is overlapped in dental morphology by primitive variants of an early to late Eocene species of Triplopus, a hyracontidid rhinoceratoid. Thus, it appears that at least one line of hyracontid rhinoceratoids evolved from Hyraxis. The evolutionary relationships of living and extinct species are traditionally recognized by comparisons of morphology. At the time of their first appearance in the fossil records at the beginning of the late Eocene, or of the Eocene, perissodactyls were already represented by the oldest members of 3 superfamilies: Hyracotherium, an equoid or horse-like individual; Homogalax, a tapiroid; and Paleomorphus, a calicotherioid. Due to scientists' focus on establishing evolutionary relationships and the fact that perissodactyls stemmed from a common ancestor, the earlier representatives of these families look very similar. They believe that early representatives of these families look very similar to each other, and many lack highly specialized features such as horns that characterize more advanced members of each family. In-depth analysis and familial relationship definitions are often based on slightly insignificant factors such as minor variations in teeth morphology in order to trace back to more primitive forms. Many species have very specialized skulls and skeletons. However, despite this diversity, all ceratomorphs have one character in common: very strongly developed transverse crests on their upper molar teeth. All early ceratomorphs, such as Hyracotherium, Homogalax, and Paleomorphus, are distinguished from each other by slight differences in molar cusp pattern and size, and in their size. By the end of the early Eocene, secondary adaptive radiations produced overlap in size between representatives of the different superfamilies, but the diagnostic dental characteristics remain constant, allowing for tracing to a common ancestor. Early perissodactyl dental cusp patterns show functional differences that allow for slight similarities in jaw articulation, but changes in chewing or grinding mechanism. This suggests specialization of anterior dentition for different food sources and niches. The differences in molar cusp patterns between the earliest equoids, taperoids, and chalicotheres indicate differences in masticatory action, at least in young individuals, and suggest dietary specialization as a factor in primary perissodactyl radiation. However, since differences in size are correlated with dental specializations as well, it is possible that size was also a factor in allowing niche differentiation in that initial radiation. One of the most striking aspects of the early evolution of the Perissodactyla is the large amount of parallel evolution that occurred. In response to selective pressures surrounding food consumption and resource availability, both Ceratomorpha groups' early ancestors went through many jaw articulations. Researchers believe some of the evolutionary characteristics arose from solely allometric factors, such as increase in body size over time. Some significant changes in early Perissodactyla during the Eocene mark important ecological and biological changes. The major evolutionary radiations of the Perissodactyla occurred during the Eocene, and for most of that epoch, they were the dominant medium-sized to large terrestrial herbivores. However, in the late Eocene, artiodactyls underwent major evolutionary radiations, possibly based on the acquisition of solenodont or cheek teeth, and coincident with the artiodactyl radiations, perissodactyl populations decline. Ecological factors such as interspecific competition and niche partitioning are generally the main drivers for adaptive radiations of groups of animals. As specialization of species increases, diversification through partitioning of ecological niche is into smaller functional groups occurs. Increased extinction rates open up new niches and allow for different species to fit into these. The divergence time between Rhinoceratoideae and Taperoideae in the Eocene, based on fossil evidence here, falls between 51 million years ago to 57.5 million years ago, as estimated from molecular data. Through research, I was able to establish how ecological factors in the rhino and tapir ranges may have shaped their individual characteristics and diversity. The 4 living species of tapirs have unusual distribution, with 3 species living in the New World and the Asian tapir in Southeast Asia. Fossil tapirs are known from Europe, Asia, and North America. And tapirs are browsers. The series of transverse shearing blades on their cheek teeth are adapted for chewing fruit, leaves, twigs, and vines. Tapirs generally live in forested areas, and their stocky build with relatively short limbs and stout torso is well suited for barreling through underbrush. The family Rhinoceratidae contains living rhinoceroses. They are represented by 5 species placed in 4 genera. 3 of these species are found in South Central Asia, and the other 2 live in Africa south of the Sahara. Rhinoceroses generally inhabit savannas, shrubby regions, and dense forests, and the African species usually live in more open areas than do the Asiatic species. All rhinos are generally restricted to areas where a daily trip to water is possible. And the ecological factors that guided the diversity of these 2 lineages, such as both inter and intra-specific competition, resource availability, and the environmental changes, caused multiple radiations early in perissodactyl evolution that eventually led to the divergence of Rhinoceratoideae and Taperoideae. Members of both groups are herbivores, but they may feed primarily on grasses or on branches, depending on the species. A distinction is often made between primarily grass feeders, such as white rhinos, and leaf feeders, such as tapirs and other rhinos. Rhinos and tapirs are both browsers, occupying important niches in most ecosystems. They are able to keep large-scale vegetation at bay that, if left untouched, would eventually destroy the habitat. Differences in teeth dentition may have been caused by contrasting food sources requiring grinding rather than chewing. Thus, dentition changes over time, though minuscule, would eventually be the basis for establishing relationships between fossil records.
Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the characteristics and traits shared by ceratomorphs and the features that are different between these families. So as Izzy said, all species of rhinos and tapirs are united by a characteristic of their dentition, which is that they have really strongly developed transverse crests on their molars, which is shown on this image on the right here. This was evolved because both of these families are herbivores. So herbivores, particularly those that utilize grazing as a feeding mechanism, are going to be exploiting grasses and leaves as their primary source of food. Because these are considered low quality resources, since an animal has to eat a large volume of them to get adequate nutrition, herbivores are going to be eating and chewing all the time, as opposed to something that eats meat or nuts, which are a lot more nutritionally dense. So as large-bodied herbivores, rhinos and tapirs have this adaptation of well-developed crests to their dentition that's going to reduce wear and tear on their enamel and allow them to constantly be chewing. This image up here also shows another characteristic that unites all of the perissodactyls, so horses in addition to tapirs and rhinos, which is a skull that's elongated at the anterior end. Another common characteristic among the ceratomorphs is that that's related to their herbivory is that they are hindgut fermenters, so they all have a cecum, which is what breaks down the cellulose that they're constantly consuming. All perissodactyls have an odd number of digits and they're unduligrades, so they walk on the tips of these digits or on their hooves. And ceratomorphs specifically are considered the three-toed unduligrades. As we got into before, tapirs' front feet are the exception to this rule. They actually have a fourth smaller digit, but their hind feet have three. The anatomy of these hooves are similar between rhinos and tapirs as well, with their digits flattened into a triangular shape and hooves made of keratin. Ceratomorphs are all mesozonic, meaning the majority of their weight is placed on the middle digit of their feet, which is also larger than the other digits. And all of these foot anatomy similarities are what allow them to run and move their bodies across their very wide ranges. And finally, ceratomorphs all have really thick, tough skin, which acts as a defense mechanism against attacks. Rhinos don't really have any predators as adults, but tapirs and young rhinos can be subject to attacks by things like pumas and crocodiles, which will sometimes attack at night, mostly when tapirs are foraging around for food. And having this super thick skin will de-incentivize attacks in the future because it hurts them to bite on something so tough. And here are some of the differences in characteristics between tapirs and rhinos. Starting with their face shapes, you can see tapirs have this flexible downturned proboscis, while rhinos have the signature nasal horn, which is actually only made of keratin. And this is unique among the horned orders because artiodactyls have horns that are made of bone and just surrounded by keratin. And then tapirs utilize browsing as a feeding mechanism in addition to grazing, which is why having that proboscis is so advantageous, so they can kind of dig around in shrubs to find food sources that are slightly higher quality than just grass and leaves. Because they're browsers, they have more of a brachydont dentition compared to the rhino's hypsodont dentition. And this just means that the crowns of tapirs' teeth are slightly lower because they're not chewing and grinding down their teeth quite as much as rhinos are, but they are also grazers, so they need that molar crest adaptation that I mentioned before. But these adaptations are much stronger in rhinos, who also have specialized incisors that grind together when they pluck up vegetation. And then finally, tapirs have a much more streamlined body shape, and they're shorter in stature than rhinos. And this is another characteristic that helps them with their browsing, so they can move through thick shrubs really easily. Here you can see some of the similarities and differences, starting with the general face shape of each animal. The rhino has those upturned incisors where the top sharpens the bottom as they chew, and their molars are much thicker and rooted a lot deeper than the tapir's molars. So in the second set of images, you can really see the rhino's hypsodont molars in comparison to the tapir's brachydont molars. And this last set of pictures is just showing the front foot of a rhino with three toes compared to the front foot of a tapir, which has that extra fourth digit that's really only used as extra support when they're walking on softer ground. And now I'm going to talk about some of the threats that tapirs and rhinos are facing. So Baird's tapirs, mountain tapirs, and Malay tapirs are all considered endangered, while the lowland tapir is just considered vulnerable. And most of this is a result of habitat loss and fragmentation caused by agriculture. For example, the Malay tapir occupies Malaysian forests that are really rapidly being converted to palm oil plantations. And then hunting pressures for the wild meat industry are also driving the decline in all 4 of these species of the tapir, particularly the mountain tapir in Peru and Colombia. And all tapir species are listed in the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species or CITES, but all their populations are still declining. So it's clear that some more stringent regulations regarding habitat conversion and hunting are going to be needed for the conservation of these species. And then the black rhino, the Javan rhino, and Sumatran rhino are all considered critically endangered, and their decline is largely due to poaching and habitat loss from human encroachment on their native habitats. These rhinos are also listed in CITES, which prohibits international trade of individuals and their horns. And this has proven to be pretty successful with the Javan and black rhinos because their populations are now stable or increasing, but habitat restoration will ultimately be necessary to get all of these species out of their endangered status. Thank you for listening to our presentation.